What do you make of like the Old Testament? What do you make of the origins of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
The biblical account is that God himself created confusion in the ranks of the Assyrian soldiers.
Is that really how God would handle it?
Well, we don't know.
Why didn't God do that
for
with
one
World War
reason or
II?
another? Yeah.
Why didn't God stop Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well,
why did God allow the Holocaust to take place?
Why did he allow the fog to descend at Normandy? I mean, I don't know.
If you're going to argue for miracles, and you're going to argue for this miracle, then you have to also explain why these other miracles don't happen. And let me just say that for Christians, when you start proclaiming the judgment of God on certain things, you do inherently bring up the question of then, well, if God did a miracle to save this person, why did he do a miracle to save that person?
All right, so this next clip, I've just got it as kind of like reliability of the Old Testament and history. That's what I have it labeled as.
Yeah.
So let me play this one and then we'll comment on it.
Okay.
What do you make of like the Old Testament? What do you make of the origins of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Like what do you think of that?
I actually have taught college classes that included an evaluation of the historical reliability of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And in many, many periods of biblical history, there is just same kind of extensive extra-biblical corroboration of the history that's provided in the Old Testament. So I think the same types of evidences can be brought to bear to provide external support. One example, it was a favorite lecture of mine, was the story of the Assyrian invasion of Judah in 701 BC. It's recorded in Kings and Chronicles. And Hezekiah is the king. And there are multiple points of agreement between the biblical record and the account of that same event in the Assyrian records, many of which are now stored in the British Museum. There's a fantastic tour you can take of the Assyrian room there, where the absolutely the same basic story is told.
But these are historical representations of things that are plausible, like sieges, things that happened all the time. It's a part of human history.
Well, right, there's something kind of mysterious about this siege and why it was broken, because the Assyrian power was overwhelming in comparison to what was left. And the biblical account is that God himself created confusion in the ranks of the Assyrian soldiers.
Is that really how God would handle it?
Well, we don't know.
Why didn't God do that
for
with
one
World War
reason or
II?
another? Yeah.
Why didn't God stop Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well,
why did God allow the Holocaust to take place?
Why did he allow the fog to descend at Normandy? I mean, I don't know.
Well, that was cool.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of, so there's two parts to that, right? There's like,
yeah. So let's just summarize the first part, 'cause I think Meyer answered it really well. The beginning of all that is Meyer, Rogan's like, well, what do you about the Old Testament and like this kind of stuff, and he's arguing that you can defend the Old Testament as a document, that there's plenty of corroboration of the Old Testament
stuff,
and the historical record. That's exactly right. And he goes into this discussion about the Sennacherib siege of Jerusalem, where Hezekiah was the king. And, he goes through all of that, and he's talking about how in Assyria, the carvings there, the dates match up and the story kind of matches, and that's really cool. And that supports the Old Testament. And you could do that with, there's tons of things.
Well,
like
and
that.
I'll say about that, we're going to have a video on that, because I went, and he mentions it, I went to the London Museum and I filmed the entire Assyria room and the Egyptian room. And I'm doing a video on the Egyptian stuff and how it relates to your Bible. And then I'm going to do one on the Syrian stuff. And it's got all kinds of cool stuff that he actually just mentioned in that video. So tune in and you can see that video on our channel. But yeah, there's the Exodus. There's what else?
The Moab Stele, where it talks about like defeating the house of David, which, the first time we see that in writing. There are extra-biblical writing. So there's lots of things that we found that corroborate the Old Testament as well as the New. But what I found actually more interesting, as philosophical level, is at the end of it all, Meyer says, and the siege was broke off because God did a miracle and sowed confusion in the Assyrian army, and they left, and then Rogan's like, is that really how God would act? So he's sort of like, he's like accusing God a little bit of like, oh, that was sort of like, you're being a bad actor. You know, you're confusing people. You shouldn't be doing that. So there's a little bit of accusation.
That doesn't sound miraculous, you know? So people just got confused. You know, it's almost like,
they start attacking each other or they flee. They don't really know. But then he's like, and why didn't he do that at, you kind of name it. I think he names Auschwitz or Hiroshima or, and you start naming sort of bad things that happen, or the Titanic or the whatever. Why did God work a miracle? If you're going to argue for miracles and you're going to argue for this miracle, then you have to also explain why these other miracles don't happen. And let me just say that for Christians, when you start proclaiming the judgment of God on certain things, God did this miracle for this person, you do inherently bring up the question of then, well, if God did a miracle to save this person, why didn't he do a miracle to save that person? He just liked them better. What's wrong with him? And that's a you do have to be careful in making those proclamations, or like reading the purpose of God into history. When you don't really know the end from the beginning, you're a creature dropped into the middle of the story that can't see the beginning or the end, frankly. So, I give you an example of this in regular life. I have a friend who, I don't know if you remember this or not, but it's been several years back now, but maybe close to 10 years now, I guess, when there was this horrific tornado that went through Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This thing was like 1.5 miles wide in the base. It was on the ground for like 15 or 16 miles, and tons of people got killed. This is an incredibly powerful thing. Mm-hmm. Well, I also have a friend who's on the police force there, and this friend who's on the police force told me something. He was like, Jameson, if you weren't a believer in God before this, you would be now, if you had seen what I've seen. And I was like, really, what have you seen? He's like, Jameson, we had to go and catalog dozens, if not hundreds of houses. And every single home we went into, I was told the exact same story when we, did the write-up. The exact same story was, we were in the house, we were hanging out. Then we heard a tornado coming. We looked outside. It was huge. We didn't have time to get away. So we were like, where should we go? And we picked a room, maybe a bathroom under some stairs, whatever. They picked the place they thought was strongest. We all went there. It passed over. When it was gone, we came out, and the entire house was destroyed, totally scraped off the foundation, gone, except the room we were in. And he was like, I heard that story over and over and over and over again. There's no way you can see what I've seen and not believe in God. Well, okay, frankly, I accept that testimony. But then you have to answer the question, what about the 300 people or so that died that day? If God worked this miracle and saved tens of thousands of lives, which is what my friend would argue, or thousands, what was wrong with those people he didn't? Mm-hmm. That's a tough question.
Right.
What I would argue is that as Christians, we have to be really, really humble when we start to approach these things. When we start to approach these things of like, this disaster happened because it was the judgment of God on this city or this place or this nation, or this thing happened because, he mentions Dunkirk, mm-hmm. Why did the fog descend at Dunkirk? That's a crazy thing in history. I mean, you have the Nazis ready to drop the hammer on the British Army, totally would have wrecked them on that beach. There would have been no rest of World War II. It would have been over. Fog rolls in for a week. The Luftwaffe couldn't fly, no air cover for the Germans. In the meantime, every single English person with a boat, sails over to Holland and pulls people off the beaches at Dunkirk, mm-hmm. saves the British Army. They could fight another day and eventually win the war. Mm-hmm. Is that God? My intuition is yes, it was. But again, why did God save them and not somebody else? So I do think we have to be very careful. And I think the Bible gives us some insight into this. And we did a whole episode on Dothan a long time ago, so I don't want to tell the whole story. But there's two stories at Dothan. One is the story of Elisha the prophet, and his servant looks out and is like, we're surrounded, we're going to die. And Elisha's like, look, there's again. Angels. Yeah. Oh, we're surrounded by angels and chariots of fire. We're fine. Of angel armies. There you go. Or it looks like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. Or like, whatever. Pick a song about that event. People are like, yay, God can save you with angels.
Yep.
But what else happened there? What else happened there was Joseph got thrown in a pit. I bet he prayed just as hard as Elisha did.
Yeah.
God, please, God, please, God, please don't let me be sold as a slave. And his brothers hauled him out of that pit, tied him up, and sold him into slavery in a country he didn't know.
Yeah.
And so you're like, well, why didn't God do this? Well, the reason God didn't save Joseph is because he was working out a plan to save his whole family and whole nations. He wanted to change the character of Joseph's family. His brothers were murderous and awful. And they needed to feel that guilt and repent, which they did. They're all, next time you see them years later, they're a lot better guys. And also Joseph was kind of a young, cocky jerk, and that needed to be worked out of him. So God is at work in the salvation, in the miracle, and in the absence of the miracle. God's equally at work in both. And we don't know the end from the beginning. Joseph, as a 13 or 14-year-old being sold, did not know what God was working at,
Yeah.
that he was still at work. So that kind of thing, that kind of generality, well, if God did that miracle, why didn't he do this one? God's bad because he's not nice. I think we have to humbly trust God.
Yeah, and I'll say one final thing on that, on miracles. If miracles were not infrequent things, then they wouldn't be miracles. They would just be normal.
Yeah.
And they would be like a lot of other things that we see that are absolute miracles that we don't even think are miracles.
Yeah, it'd be like childbirth, right? Which should be called a miracle. We're just like,
I mean,
or our flower blossoming, or
you can argue so many things in nature, just like, oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, it's proven by science that it happens, but that's just because it happens all the time.
Yeah, and we stop appreciating it.
Yeah, and you can say that things. So, like, I think Meyer actually, he says in here, like, it's not necessarily that miracles are breaking the laws of nature. It's just, I mean, God is like
kind of shaking the table is how he calls it.
Speaking into it, right?
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandofthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.